Welcome to round two of African Schools Debate Championship. And the motion for today's round reads, it has a long info slide, but pardon me, I'm not going to read the info slide. Let me just do this. So a maximum price occurs when the government sets a limit on the price of goods or services with the aim of reducing or keep price below the market equilibrium price. For example, the government may set a maximum price of bread of $1 or a maximum price of weekly rent of $150. So then the motion goes. So with that being said, I would invite the Prime Minister's comments to this debate. Here. Sorry, the first speaker for said proposition. Yeah.
Afternoon, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, because of bandwidth issues, I'm not going to be able to switch my camera on. And I would like to take my points of information verbally. So if you have any points of information, please unmute yourselves and just ask. And my preferred pronouns are he, him, and I'll be beginning my speech in a couple of seconds. I need to get my timer ready. I will be beginning my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, developing nations are places of large amounts of disparity in all sectors. The biggest disparity, however, might just be the disparity in opportunity. Because all of the developing nations' development usually happens in large cities, rural areas are left behind development-wise. It means that most business opportunities and most employment opportunities are going to be found within larger cities rather than rural areas. This means that large cities become a beacon of opportunity for anyone in the country who wants to make something of themselves, who wants to get employment, who wants to enjoy the benefits of the development that is happening within their countries. And because people have been rightly attracted to this development, right? Rural to urban migration is always at a high in developing nations as people travel from rural areas to larger cities because they want to enjoy the benefits of employment, they want to make something of themselves, and they want to get some employment that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise in rural areas. Now, the problem arises at a point in time where in order to live in a city, in order to live anywhere, right, you need housing. And most people, are, and this has created an opportunity for landlords to exploit people who are moving to these cities. Because there's a very high demand of housing given the number of people that are moving to cities. Because of this high demand, they can afford to raise pricing so that housing is given to the highest bidder. This is why you find someone spending almost 90% of their income on simply rent when they could have used that money for education, for food, in order to feed their children, and in order to make their lives better. Government thus has a mandate to come in and prevent this exploitation of its people, even if it comes at the cost of some people, or even if it comes at the expense of some landlords or some landowners. We are proud to propose. So what does maximum rent pricing look like on our side of the house? We think that maximum rent pricing looks like government setting rent pricing or to an analyzed and reasonable number that they think accepted.
Realistically, most developing nations struggle with the basic necessities. Why put a maximum price limit on something that isn't really as important as those necessities?
We think that housing is actually the most important thing you could think of, especially in these developing nations. People need somewhere to live in order to be able to actually be able to go to work, in order for them to be able to live with their children. Housing is one of the most important things that you could argue a human being needs. So, I don't get where you're trying to take that point of information. So talking about what maximum rent pricing looks like, right? It looks like the government analyzing the market. It looks like government analyzing the income of the people who they're talking about. It looks like government analyzing all these different things, right? Then and inflation as well, and coming up with a reasonable price that they think that housing should be, that they think that housing should cost, right? And then setting this price so that people have to, so that landowners cannot increase their amount, their pricing for their housing above a certain that's it limit tonight. So government sets appropriate. So it also looks like government setting appropriate rate limits depending on location. So that means that in high density areas you get low rent caps, for example, because you obviously it makes more sense. It just makes sense that in smaller areas that or in high density areas that you're going to get housing being at lower costs. So and then so in general, what we think rent pricing should look like is that rent pricing should not or should be implemented with the set goal of making sure that people are not spending an arm and a leg simply for housing. So we think that rent pricing means that people have to pay less for housing and people are not going to be exploited. It means that people are not being made to pay so much more than they're able to pay simply because of the necessity and the desperation that they have for housing. So why can't the market regulate itself? Firstly, we think that we can't accept a world in which the market simply regulates itself, especially in these developing nations, because of two main reasons. Firstly, these developing nations are places that are known for having unstable economies, and secondly, because of high demand. So firstly, what do we mean when we talk about unstable economy? We mean that landlords are going to we mean that economies are so unstable and are always changing depending on especially in developing nations, because of the nature of these countries. They're usually impoverished and any change is likely to impact the economy. Denied. Most changes are likely to impact the economy in such a way that the price is always changing. Now, this means that landlords are going to have to keep changing their pricing. They're going to have to keep increasing their pricing, right? So that it is in such a way that they are able to cope with the changes that are happening within the market. We think that this is problematic, right? Because this means that the market can't rightfully regulate itself at a point in time where people do not even have the time to sit down and to be able to look for better options because of how the market is always and consistently and constantly fluctuating, right? So at a point in time where people cannot where the market cannot let itself be regulated, we think that we cannot allow the market to regulate itself, and government should stand in, and government with its expertise and knowledge and understanding of what is happening within the country should be able to regulate this market so that it's beneficial to its people. But secondly, we think that's because of high demand. High demand means landlords are king, right? Even if we were to say that the market is going to regulate itself, we think that market equilibrium is going to be in favor of landlords. Why is this? Because there are so many people who want housing. Landlords can afford to increase the price of housing to the highest bidder, and this highest bidder often has to pay an arm and a leg simply so that they can get housing accepted.
Please note on your side, if you don't have the highest bidder, everyone's essentially just going to be paying the same amount of prices. So you just have more individuals being able to pay the same amount of housing prices. How does this solve any of your issues?
It solves the problem of exploitation, and it means that people are not paying an arm and a leg to get a job. They're not paying 90% of the income because the government sets a limit so that people are not paying so much money that they aren't able to spend it on things that are actually more important to them, like food, or that are actually important to them, like food, like education for their children, all these different things. Moving on, we think that market regulation in and of itself is something that cannot be considered, because market regulation is always going to be in favor. Market regulation is always going to be in favor of the landlords more so than it is going to be in favor of the people that we care about the most in this debate, the people who are vulnerable and who are likely to be exploited by these landlords. So because we act to prevent the exploitation of individuals, and because we act to protect the people who are moving to these cities, and because we act to make sure that people are not losing so much money that they aren't able to spend it on things that are so important to them, that are there and because we act to prevent exploitation, we are proud to propose, and we are proud to win this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Speaker, for a very fair speech. At this point, we'll take the very first speaker for the opposition to commence the case of Proposition side. Yeah. Introduce
Cool.
yourself,
Everyone
how
hear me?
you then start. Thank you.
Could I quickly just get some water before I do that? Okay.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, perfect. My name is Leseho. I'll be the O1. He, him pronouns, and I prefer POIs verbally. Cool. Given that, then I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. What's really concerning about the entirety of the proposition first is how he hasn't really considered the main issues that developing nations have to suffer. The fact that they cannot be able to get the basic necessities, which is bread and food, because of how high prices are overall in the economy. We don't think that we need to be prioritizing ourselves over having a rent income within residential areas. Firstly, because of how high market prices are there. But secondly, we think that the main aim of developing nations is to make sure that people have an economic stability, which is like able to like let them access things that are basic towards their development as people. On our side, then, we think that we validate having to like have maximum prices with other things, such as having food, have a maximum price, and all of those things, because those are things that are much more necessary towards individuals. We don't think that their case really solves the problems that poor people and people in developing nations face. Two things then that we're going to be talking about in my speech. Firstly, why we think that it's unjustified and illegitimate for us to focus specifically on like maximum prices with residential rent. But secondly, why it's something that's most likely going to be straining towards the developing nations. My second speaker then will talk to you about why we think that isn't like, why we think that having to set a maximum price on residential rent is something that isn't likely to bring much development. But before that, let's deal with a few pieces of context that were like really missed from the proposition side. First things first is residential areas and understanding what they are. We think that like most of these areas are expensive because of the lack of money that we have as developing nations. So we keep them this way in order to make sure that we have a like really good flow of money having to come in, i.e. with Santin in South Africa. We think that we like need people who have the ability to invest in these areas in order like to stay in these areas, mainly because of how there isn't there isn't really much income coming into these areas to begin with. So we think that we keep them within high standards and price rates because of how there is just a lack of funding within like the developing nation. But secondly, maximum rent prices and what they really mean. We think that in this case, government money needs to suffice for the loss of flow in the economy. So they need to validate for the government having to fund all of these prices and having to fund all of these rents and making sure that they keep like stability within these economies. This is something that they need to prove in their second, and they've completely lacked in their first, because we think that the main mechanism towards having a like system like this and a theory like this working is if the government is able to provide enough of an income for you to sustain that development, but moreover for you to sustain that very same economy and very same residential area. So why do we think that this context is something that's important? Firstly, it shows the government obligation that like we have from proposition that needs to be fulfilled. But secondly, it shows you the impracticality of their case, given as to how not everyone needs to live in Santon. Rather, we need to have a different kind of goal set and a different kind of mindset in order to ensure the like economic like stability and economic fairness of people within those developing nations. Now, given that, let's move into my matter. Note then, most of my rebuttal will be integrated with the matter. So I'll flag you when I get to the responses that I have. Now, given that, then let's move into that matter. The first claim that we have is why we think a maximum rent policy is principally illegitimate to developing countries. And here we ask ourselves the question: what is the main goal of developing countries? Two things. Firstly, it is development. So it means that we value that means that we What we value is letting much bigger industries continuously developing for us and to have a stable income from a central area. That's why we have the profit that we have currently as developing nations, because of how we keep maximum rent prices very high within certain areas of the country, i.e. Lagos and Nigeria. So we keep these things high because of how we want to have a stable income and not have something that's quite similar to the rest of the population. But secondly, we think that it's having equal access of basic services. So this means that not everyone needs to live in Santon, but rather everyone needs to feed their children. And the real problem right now is the fact that in Zimbabwe, bread costs much more than $100. We think that we'd much rather have a maximum price being set up in something that is necessary towards individuals, which is food and necessities, and rather have it onto a house that is built up in the capital of the country. We think why that's important is firstly because of how the main goal and the main justified goal of countries is to make sure that people have something to eat and to make sure that economically you can afford the things that you need to survive. So we think on our side, comparatively, we're much more justified in having to do something that really sets a maximum price on basic necessities rather than having to set it on a house. Why is this the case? Firstly, we fulfill our goals as a government because the main priority is to make sure that the people who need this kind of access most are catered for when they need something. So this is to say that they need food and necessities much more than they need housing. Thus, then we need to cater for that specifically. But secondly, we think that on our side, that very same need is something that needs to be catered for much more. We think then this argument becomes important because of how we cater for those goals much better on our side once we don't focus on maximum rent prices, but much rather maximum prices on something that's much more important, such as necessities go.
Okay, seeing as you want to ensure that people can afford these necessities, do you not think it's better to provide a world in which large sums of money are not spent specifically on rent, but can be diverted towards these necessities?
Here's where that very same analysis goes very, very wrong. The rent prices for capital cities and estates in capital cities are relatively high to begin with. That means that the very same policy that they set up needs to be a very low income amount, which isn't likely to be sustainable for the very same countries, but moreover, to keep up with the very same standard of those cities, you'd most likely have to have the government having to fill up for those gaps, which is very hard because of how those very same countries don't have enough money to do so. That leads me on to my second argument of why we think that the maximum rent theory is straining to people in developing nations. How is this possible? Firstly, for poorer individuals to be able to access these areas, you would need to set prices at an all-time low. That means two things. Firstly, that since the current prices of rent in these residential areas are so high, the bar isn't going to be shifted to the likings of poorer individuals because of how we need to sustain the economic development of those countries. But secondly, this shows how hard access is for poorer individuals with or without maximum rent. So you're most likely not going to see much of a benefit happening towards them or the much poorer individuals specifically, but to other individuals. So who are these people? The middle class. For the individuals who can access those areas, which is the middle class, you're most likely going to have a far harder job of sustaining the infrastructure of those residential places. Why is this a problem and why does this harm exist? Firstly, you don't benefit the people that proposition assumes that they're going to be benefiting, which is the poor people. Because of how the standard isn't likely to be set as low as we want it to, because we need to sustain development, we don't think that we're likely to get the long-term goal that we want from proposition. But secondly, we think that you devalue the one part of the economy that is bringing the most income, the real estate. And that's harmful because of how the market is most likely to crash, i.e. the 2008 market crash in the US because of how real estate wasn't really invested much in and was made relatively low for individuals to access. The realism of this debate is that not everyone needs to live in a very high class society. We're okay with having to let people to live in lower classes, but we'd much rather make sure that they have the basic necessities catered for rather for them to afford rent in a much bigger area.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much, Speaker, for a very fine speech. At this point, we'll take the very second oppositional speaker to advance the case of side proposition. So second prop speaker of measures. Please do note the time. I'll try and share my screen, so we'll be checking the screen for the time too, so we don't get budget in our very last minutes. So second prop, the floor is yours. I hope I'm audible. Second proposition, I hear.
Sorry, please give our second pop speaker a little bit of time. Their Wi-Fi cut out, so they just need to reconnect.
Sure.
Sorry for that. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you're audible.
Sorry, network had dropped for a second. Right. Okay, granted that I'm still audible, I'll be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, we find side opposition's case extremely problematic at the point in which they refuse to acknowledge the basic necessities that a human being needs to survive, right? These basic necessities are not only food, but in fact is housing and a form of accommodation wherever they go. So at the point in which they refuse to accept the fact that people do need a household or people do need somewhere to stay, we see their case being problematic. Second thing that we see being problematic in this case is the false characterization that they give us of these large cities. We tell you that these large cities are not necessarily just Sandton as a unit, but we tell you that large cities have different types of forms of accommodation and residential areas, right? We give you the example of Harare, where you have high density areas such as Goromonzi, you have high density areas such as Wampakti and the like, and you have low density areas such as the Brook and the like, right? So we tell you that at the point in which you acknowledge, the side of the house that wins this debate is the one that acknowledges both sides of the spectrum, right? And ensures that these people have a form of accommodation on both sides of the spectrum, right? So first of all, we tell you a side proposition that at the point in which somebody has to survive off of beans and a slice of bread on a weekly basis, simply in order for them to find a form of employment, because this is where employment opportunities are at their peak. This is the beacon of employment opportunities. We find that rent that they're paying extremely problematic. What side proposition opts to mitigate, right, is the exploitation that occurs within these large cities, because landowners understand the desperate need that people have to live within these large cities. We tell you that they're more likely to exploit the people that come into these areas, right? They're more likely to exploit somebody that is coming from a rural area, that is coming from a smaller city, in the hopes of finding a form of employment or in the hopes of finding a form of employment or a new job opportunity within these large cities, right? We tell you these people are extremely vulnerable and are willing to do anything, are willing to pay anything in order for them to boost themselves and and give them employment, and give them the chances and the opportunities that are necessary for them to thrive, right? So rebuttals that we get. So the main idea that we get from side opposition is the idea of keeping these residential areas steady in order to get a stable inflow of money and the like, right? So we tell you that at the point in which we agree that not everyone needs to live in the brooks of each country, right? But we tell you that people still need to ensure that the accommodation that they have is affordable. If they want to lobby for a world in which people can afford basic necessities, we tell you that that world is our world, a world in which the prices of housing is not so exorbitant that people can divert their money into other right? We tell you that at the point in which you claim that these residential areas are a source of income, we tell you side proposition is not proposing that housing be free. You still get a source of income from these residential areas. We're just telling you on our side of the house, it's not as exorbitant, right? Now I'm going to move on to my positive. But before I do, I'll take a point from up.
You need to understand from what we told you in our O1 that everything is very costly. You need to make the way up. Do you want people to live in luxury housing, or do you want them to be able to afford basic necessities?
Okay, so we tell you again and again, right, that we agree that things are costly. We agree that things need to be paid for. If your only problem with the idea of having a price cap and a maximum rate is the idea that we're only implementing with housing, we see that you don't actually have is the idea that we're not implementing it with food. We see that you don't necessarily have a problem, and a concession that you do make is that you don't have a problem with having a maximum cutoff for housing. You just need it to be transferred onto food and the like, right? Which we tell you is not the motion that we have at hand. The motion that we have at hand is dealing specifically with housing. And we tell you that we need this money to be able, we need this housing to not be so high so that people can divert their money, can divert other forms of income, and can divert some money towards these highly expensive things that you guys, that side opposition cries about. Now onto my substantial pieces of matter. First of all, we tell you why market regulation is not enough. We've shown you how market regulation specifically works when there are other forms of housing available, or there are other forms of accommodation available, right? We've shown you how demand is constantly increasing within these large cities, right? We tell you that these large cities don't necessarily, once again, we reiterate that these large cities don't necessarily mean the broke alone. These large cities account for high density and low density areas. We agree that people don't necessarily all have to live in such beautiful, lavish houses, but we tell you that they need to live in some type of housing, right? And we've shown you how this housing is, how people are looking for this housing within these high density, within these large cities. So market regulation has proven not to work at the point in which people still need to have a house and demand continues to increase, but you see self-regulating, demand continues to increase, but supply does not, right? A house is not like a common phone or something. It's something that everybody needs, and it's a right that everybody has, right? So at the point in which it's hard to get this housing and the like, we see a problem. A second thing that we see is that you promote overall economic growth in our side of the house and in our world. How you do so? We tell you that overall economic growth is achieved at the point in which people can find jobs and people can find employment. We've shown you how large cities are a beacon of employment opportunities, where majority of jobs and companies are found within these large cities, and people flock towards these large cities. They become a beacon of employment opportunities and opportunities for people to grab life by the horns and ensure that they optimize on the opportunity that they have, right? So in a world where people can now afford to live within these large cities, afford to seek out their lives, afford to find a new job without the fear of how they're going to live within that area, right? We tell you that this is the best way to promote economic growth. This policy best applies in developing nations. This policy is taking place or is going to be implemented in developing nations. These are the nations that desperately need this specific form of economic growth, right? These are the places that need these people, that need the highest number of people to find employment opportunities, to find ways in which they can further or grow economically. Another piece of positive matter that we give you is why it is justified to intervene within these places, right? Why it is justified to intervene and why this is a justified course of action. We tell you that because governments have now recognized how exorbitant and how detrimental this how detrimental these prices are towards the people, we see government taking action to ensure protection for its people, right? We see governments put
Am I the only person who can't hear the speaker?
I'm unable to hear them as well. I think they cut off.
Yeah,
Okay, so sure. I think she cuts off in the remaining 37 or 38 seconds. So I think we have to reach. So teammates, please try and reach her because she still seems unmuted, meaning she's speaking, but we can't hear her. Disconnected now. So Team Prop, try and reach your partner and let's finish the remaining seconds she has. Yeah, yeah, she's in now.
Am I
Yeah, hi,
audible?
speaker. We lost you. Yes, you are audible. We lost you in your remaining 8 seconds. Yeah.
If I may ask, what was the last thing that you heard?
So you are still trying to justify why people need access to the cities and how governments needs to intervene. That's
Okay, okay.
the timer will resume when you speak. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be continuing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Side proposition tells you that the most vulnerable stakeholder in this debate is somebody that has just moved into the city and is hoping to find employment opportunities. Somebody who doesn't necessarily have the highest amount of money, to back them up and to back them up, right? We tell you that these are the people that are most affected by this policy. These are the people that are most affected by the prices that are within these large cities, right? So at the point in which both sides concede to how expensive life is within these large cities, and both sides concede to how necessary how important other forms of other things are. At this point in which both sides concede to the fact that other things are important, we see an agreement that you can't have rent being too exorbitant, which is why, as side proposition, we're proud to oppose exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, second speaker for side opposition, for a very fine speech. At this point, we would call the second speaker for side opposition to advance the case for side opposition.
Hello, my name is Imama Uddin and my pronouns are she, her. I would like my POIs verbally, and just give me 2 seconds to get my notes in order and to get my time out. I'll be with you in a second.
Sure.
Okay, cool. I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. As Karl Marx says, we are only able to get communism at the height of capitalism. That is to say, it has worked in the past with China. China, who grew the economy to be the second leading economic power in the world through capitalistic mechanisms, they are now one of the most economically sufficient countries for themselves. That is to say, the inside props debate is not with side opposition, but rather with history. History, with side opposition's case, has worked and will continue to work. Now to further our case, I'll be giving you an argument on how it is pragmatically not justified to set maximum prices. But before that, I'll be offering some very needed strategic clarity and some rebuttal. Now onto my strategic clarity. 2 main important points here. There's a major practical gap within side proposition's case. That is to say, when they talk about allocation of government funds for basic necessities, they talk about housing, they talk about food. We agree with that. We concede to that. Housing and food is important. But we would rather have a filled stomach than go to a bed in a king-size mattress. We'd rather have housing than luxury housing where we have to compromise our other basic necessities. That is to say that practically and principally they fall short there because they're not actually catering for the basic needs like they say in the P1. Secondly, there's a major lack of understanding on how maximum prices really work. That is to say that governments are the ones who are going to be implementing this kind of loss of money. Government is going to be the one who's going to be filling in the gaps in the market economy. That means that you're going to be squeezing the government dry of its funds, because a lot of them, because it's insane how much money comes out of the residential areas. To cut that off completely is to cut away a major chunk of the government's money, right? Yeah, sure. The impact here is that, yeah, sure, the parliament is filled with clowns, but there's only so many balls they can juggle at once. We think that you fall short in properly understanding how status quo works. That is to say that we cannot trust your inconsistent case of maximum prices if you don't even have a concrete mechanism as side proposition. Now that we've moved on from strategical clarity, we have proven to you that side propositions shooting themselves in the foot strategically by not understanding how things work and having practical and principle gaps within the case. I'll be moving on to my rebuttal. We answer the main question, are they better for economic growth like they say they are? Side proposition gives us the idea here that they are better for economic growth because of job creation. 3 reasons why this is quite funny. Firstly, some analysis on which people are really going to be getting these jobs. We tell you that what's likely going to happen is there's going to be a major disparity between the rich and the poor with an abolishment of the middle class, because they are the ones who, because the middle class is the ones who are going to be able to afford these houses even at maximum prices, right? They're the ones who are going to get these jobs in the they're going to be the ones who are going to get these jobs in these areas, right? That means that disparity is just, poor people are just going to get poorer and rich people are just going to get richer with denied, with development being stunted there. But secondly, even if we were to agree that job creation might be something plausible, we tell you that it's going to be still a very low standard of living for the ones who are getting these jobs because of due to things like overpopulation, like my first speaker already said, lack of transportation, lack of any kind of proper infrastructure is going to mean very harmful environments for these people to work in and possibly stunting the financial institutions themselves. Thirdly, then on the comparative, let's see who's better. We think that on long-term wise, we're better because to grow the economy means to give jobs. So when we prioritize the economy, we're going to be doing side propositions, job better for them in the long term. So through the metric of long term, we take them in this debate. Before I move on to my substantive, I will be taking a POI.
Okay. Seeing
The
as
side
we've shown,
opposition acknowledge that government doesn't have to make up for losses because housing in cities is generally private property.
Yes, but once you set a max price, what's likely going to happen is that you're going to cut away a big chunk of the market and the economy, something that the government is going to have to suffice for anyways. So we don't see how that analysis under your side stands. Now that I've answered the POI, I'll be moving on to my argument on how we're pragmatically not justifying setting maximum prices. The conclusion that we're going to be deriving here is that economically, we stunt growth of developing countries. Now, 2 pieces of context for my argument to be true. Firstly, money that we get from rent. In large cities, it's the grease for the market wheels. That is to say, to get the market running, we have to keep the money that we get from rent. We have to, because we also get money from taxes that these financial institutions pay. And it's not money from taxes, we get taxes based on the operations that they run within these large cities panel. Second piece of context here is that there's going to be a likely devaluation of land once you set maximum prices, because that's, this is an extension of my first speaker's context, when Lesego says that there's going to be overpopulation. What overpopulation does is it lowers the prices of these large residential areas. That is to say, the impact here is that you're taking away money, not only from the government, but also from the people who are living in those large residential areas. Now, 3 layers as to why this conclusion will be achieved. First layer is that you have an investment deterrence. Logically, institutions are not going to invest in cheap places with low revenue because they are profit incentivized. It's what financial institutes are polished for. Now, 3 reasons why this is going to be bad. Firstly, there's going to be a major loss of jobs. It's going to harm the most vulnerable active, the very active that they want to protect by giving them jobs. We tell you that they do quite the opposite. Secondly, there's going to be a loss of innovation. Foreign investment is what determines how we are able to put our best foot forward within the global market. If foreign investments with the advanced technology and the advanced market strategies don't come into developing nations, we're likely going to be left in the dust. Thirdly, there's going to be a major loss of taxes, like I said, in my context, you're taking away a large chunk of government funding and financial funding. Now, the impact here is that the thriving house markets are crucial to economic development. Now, compromisation of that leads to what happens exactly under prop. This proves our burden of proof that you're counterproductive to economic growth, something that we've been doing since our first speaker. Second level analysis is that you have higher rates of exploitative landlords. That is to say that cheap houses are bought up quickly because of the max prices. Two reasons why this is bad. Firstly, houses being bought out from economically disenfranchised people. That is to say that people who are going to be buying these are the people who can afford to buy these at bulk, i.e. the rich people. Secondly, the ownership that exists in their hands will increase disparity. Because why? The private property that they have now is going to be at a larger state, right? Now, thirdly, then, why do we steadily grow economy and why do we do it better than prop? We tell you that they fail to pragmatically support the argument. This is an ecos debate. That is to say that they took majorly on principles of basic needs, but they don't exactly tell us how they're going to have mechanisms to advance the economy, other than just repeat like a broken record end on end that basic necessity is important. So in conclusion, panel, we've given you a principle and we've given you a pragmatic on how our side is likely going to be beneficial for the most vulnerable actors. We protect the actors better than them. We do their job better than them. We win today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Speaker, for a very fine speech. At this point, we'll move on to have a very third speaker for side proposition. So continue the case for side proposition. So side proposition, third speaker. Audible, the floor is yours. Please, we are advised to turn on our cameras when speaking. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to check that I'm audible.
Yeah, you are audible.
And is my camera working?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, please might just have 2 seconds to gather up my points quickly. Okay. Assuming that I'm audible, I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, at a point in time where we let selfish and exploitative capitalistic structures roam free, unchecked, we as a government have failed our first and foremost mandate to protect our people. The very people we'll call into the city to contribute to the economical activity. We are failing to provide something as basic and crucial as housing for them. And our only response is to adopt a laissez-faire attitude, whilst the wealthy make exponentially more than what is needed. This is why, as team government, we are proud to propose a motion which provides just the mechanism to ensure the protection of the vulnerable while promoting the growth of these fragile developing nations whose economies are not stabilized yet. In my speech, you're going to get 3 main things. First of all, I'm going to give you my rebuttals integrated under the clashes in today's debate. Second of all, you're going to get important uncontested matters by opposition. And third of all, you're going to get a comparative analysis and a rundown of the debate as a whole. So the first main clash we got today was the clash of the importance of housing, which we thought was actually quite a minor clash, but we still engaged with them adequately on this. So the first speaker of opposition came and said that housing is not important in comparison to other basic necessities like food, and they would rather put a price cap on that. And to that, we conceded the fact that yes, things and other basic necessities are important for people living within these cities, but we believe that housing is actually included in those, and one of the most important things. And my second speaker told you and engaged adequately on this, but I'd like to expand on that. So this is problematic of thinking that housing is not important because, okay, if people aren't housed, they're going to be on the streets. And as a government, we can't be letting our people roam in the streets because this is simply not an ideal situation for a developing nation or any nation at all. Secondly, this actually puts more pressure on government housing facilities. So if more people can't afford this housing, that means more people are going to be homeless, right? And if more people are homeless, that means government has to provide. And the fact that government has to provide, this puts pressure on their facilities, and the only way government can compensate for this is by increasing taxes, which affects the economy as a whole and can lead to an actual recession on their side of the house. I'll take you in a minute. And then we believe that this is a larger scope of impact and is more detrimental than any form of bad thing that can happen on our side of the case. I'll take your point now.
Please
I'll take
note
your
on
point
your
now.
side, when you talk about government housing having more pressure, when you allow individuals into the cities, we think the infrastructure is going to be under a lot more pressure. So you're just shifting that pressure into the major cities and saying to government that they still have to cater for these people. Why is this a sufficient way of solving this?
This is sufficient in the fact that when there's private property and private housing, this is being dealt with people on a one-on-one basis. So rather than all the pressure being put on one entity, which is the government, it's spread out over a lot of these landlords, and it is less pressure and it's more manageable in that situation. So that's why we say this as team proposition. And also to that point, I'd like to add that this essentially harms the economy and development, because now the government has less funds to put towards infrastructure, education, and creating more jobs and opportunities within these cities, which you, as side opposition, said that you want to prioritize within today's debate. And so we also believe that they miscontextualize this in today's debate when they stated that we want everyone to live in sandstone and lush places and everything. But we stated to you in our first speaker speech that these price caps will vary according to the location, thus accommodating everyone who'd like to live within the city. No, I won't take you now. Secondly, there was the point of inflation and market regulation. So they said that the government will have to make up for the loss of housing. And on that, we told you it's untrue, because most housing is private property. So that means that this money is not even going to the government in the first place, it's going to these landlords. So by us decreasing the price cap, and even if there is a loss, which we stated will not even be that credible. Even if there is a loss, the government will not incur the bill, and this one affects people by having to pay more taxes. So like I said, if people can't afford these houses, they're homeless, and now the government has to compensate. And this is more problematic and creates a harsher situation for economic development to actually occur. So side opposition said restart economic growth. But this actually occurs on opposition side, because if people can't afford to live in the cities, they'll return to the rural areas. Because in these developing nations, rural-urban migration is currently occurring, right? So if there are less people participating in the economy, in the trade hub of the city, that means our GDP goes down. That means we're not producing as much. And that means that the very economy they're trying to grow simply cannot grow on their side of the house. So now just to go to a comparative analysis quickly. First of all, the main stakeholders in today's debate. So we'll look at the landlords first. Okay, so they stated that the landlords will probably be affected by the price caps, and they may essentially get less profit. And we think this is a trade-off we're willing to make, although we think that this less profit or loss they make is not substantial enough to warrant not passing this motion. We think this is a trade-off we're willing to make, because first of all, this is an additional source of income to the income that they already have. So these landlords are trying to get a surplus, trying to get a profit, and they're not spending for their lives, spending to feed their kids or to educate their kids with this money. So that's on the first level. On the second level, we think on a principle level, prioritizing curbing exploitation over protecting people who contribute to the toxic nature of capitalism is more important in today's debate on a principle level. And third of all, we believe that this system will end up regulating itself once the GDP increases. Because we told you how this market cannot, I will not take you, and I won't take any more PRIs for the rest of my speech. We told you how this system can't regulate itself, because with something like housing, inflation increases when demand increases. And with something like housing, demand is always there. People are always going to need a house. Therefore, we can't expect the market to self-regulate, and that's why the government has to take the mandate to actually address this issue. So secondly, now to look at the people migrating. On a practical level, they need to be prioritized, because they are contributing to the economy that we're trying to grow. Because if we have more people participating within the economy, and this naturally happens in the hub of the country or the city, then our GDP increases, like I said. So this is especially important for developing countries, because development is key to their growth. So on a second level, we believe exploitation of any form is unacceptable. So on a principle level, we take this argument and we have the higher moral ground. Thirdly, we believe this increase in homelessness and pressure on the government, thus increased taxes, and this is problematic for everyone and anyone, thus making their side of the house simply inefficient for anyone within the state. Now to look at the government. First of all, the government have a mandate to intervene because the people are being exploited. And at a point in time where the people are being hurt, the government has a mandate to intervene. Second of all, we believe it's actually in their best interest, because they're protecting the economy. Because first of all, they're curbing inflation. Because if we allow a system like housing where self-regulation doesn't work, that means inflation is more likely to occur. And this will drastically affect these lower economically developed countries that can't deal with inflation as easily as higher developed countries. So we need to curb this. And also this supports rural urban migration and promotes people moving to the urban area to partake in the city's trade hub. So on their world, we have landlords being able to set prices anyhow, and with the demand of housing constantly increasing, that's turning housing expensive. And secondly, exploitation can occur in their house, on their side of the house, unchecked, because these people are desperate for housing, and housing is something basic. They can't run away from it. At the end of the day, you're going to need somewhere to sleep, to eat, and to live in general. Even if you want to apply for a job, you need to have a residential address. So their point on creating jobs simply doesn't make sense. So inflation is likely to occur on their side of the house. And on our world, ladies and gentlemen, we've shown you how, first of all, exploitation is curbed, our people are protected. Secondly, GDP is protected, and more people are participating within the economy. And with that, I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Speaker, for your reference speech. So at this point, we'll have the very final speaker from the side opposition. And today's debate for us. Yeah. Third top speaker. Hi, third top speaker.
Am I audible?
Yes, please. You are also encouraged to turn on the camera. Thank you.
Okay. Pronouns are he, him. I'll take my POI verbally. Just give me 2 seconds. Okay. Am I good to start?
Yeah, so is the camera going to come on? We advise
No.
on the camera. That's
No,
fine.
camera's not on.
So,
Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think two of the biggest strategic mistakes that side proposition made were 2 things. Firstly, 1, identifying competition as exploitation. And secondly, 2, not understanding how infrastructure was going to have more pressure if more people were in these major cities. But secondly, then, there's an issue with what their third speaker tells us. They tell us that the prices are going to vary depending on what city we are in. Thus, this means that if you are in Sandton, you're still going to have to pay the same 200,000 Rand that exists because the area is priced at that range. So they don't actually solve any of the issues which they've identified within today's debate, which means most of what they've presented isn't irrelevant. But let's take them for their best. So firstly, a couple of things that we need to identify is the 3 major concessions that they make. Firstly, 1, individuals don't have to live in major cities. Secondly, that things are always going to be costly, especially when we're talking about things such as property. But thirdly, then, the only way to get economic growth is by ensuring that individuals have jobs. Note, these 3 things clearly show you that if an individual lives in Sandton or lives in a major city or not, doesn't affect whether or not the economy is going to grow, and thus then says that they really didn't have a case that we were going to engage with. But moreover, let me clear what they give to us that isn't really important in today's debate. Firstly, we simply don't get this idea of like these properties can't regulate themselves, when what they tell us is that the properties are going to regulate themselves is because essentially the prices are going to vary. Secondly, then, we think this whole idea of exploitation, as I've
so am I the only one missing the speaker?
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. You're audible. So sorry.
Okay. I'll continue. Where did I end off?
Yeah, problem solved.
What was the last thing you heard me say?
So you're trying to justify why people's residents of themselves does not give any justification to the economic brain.
Okay.
3,
3, 2, 1. So in it being said that their housing doesn't give a justification for growth means that it's not the priority of a developing nation and it isn't within the aims of developing nations, therefore cannot be considered something that is legitimate. Now let's go on to the two clashes. Firstly, who is better for the economic growth and development of these countries? And then secondly, I'll go into essentially the principal justification. On the first idea of who's better for economic growth, on our side, we tell you that the status quo is a lot better. Two reasons. One, we give incentive to other individuals who are outside of these countries, so foreign investment MECs, to invest into the country because there's a sense of security in these high and very expensive areas because they know that these areas aren't going to be devalued. But secondly then, is the idea that if we don't allow too many individuals into these areas, there isn't going to be massive infrastructure strain on these places, thus then meaning government doesn't have to worry about these areas. But second to that, government is able to benefit through things such as taxation, which means that they are getting a financial benefit which they can use for the majority of citizens within that nation. What did they give us? Firstly, they tell us that we simply aren't justified in doing this because it's a sense of exploitation. But secondly, then, that housing actually is the first thing that we need to ensure so individuals can get more jobs. Why does this simply not fall? Firstly, we tell you, individuals don't have jobs because they're uneducated. In most instances, they aren't going to find a job in a major city because they don't have a degree. We see the most amount of individuals being like cleaners trying to clean a company's business. If we have too many of those individuals within these cities, one, we think that you just increase the competition for jobs, which means that you don't create more jobs. But secondly, once you cap the prices at which these houses can be made, there's less investment, meaning there's less job creation within these cities, and individuals actually aren't able to benefit, which thus then means, one, you don't get your economic growth on your side, but secondly then, individuals aren't finding jobs. What they now have is that they have houses that they can't pay for, which means one of two things. Either one, they're most likely just going to leave those houses and leave them isolated, meaning that infrastructure is going to die down, or secondly then, they aren't going to be able to pay for it and government is going to have to compensate, which means government is spending more resources on these individuals. Second to that, which is something we need to clear up, is that private entities don't supply us with electricity and water and sewage systems. It's always going to be government. Once you put pressure on those infrastructures, we think that responsibility falls onto government. And once you stretch them out and place more pressure, we simply think that you're illegitimate and ineffective, which thus then shows you at the end of this clash that on our side, the reason why we're better and we're able to ensure development is greater on our side is two reasons. One, we still get the investments, meaning that we can put money elsewhere in the country to ensure rural areas don't have to stay rural anymore. But secondly, then, we don't put pressure on government to essentially cater for individuals who can't cater for themselves. On that clash, then, we win. I'll take a POI before I go into my second clash.
Please engage with the spectrum that is a large city, acknowledging the fact that there are low density and high density areas with this, within these large cities.
Okay, great. So she didn't listen. Firstly, on the fact that we're in high density areas, we're talking about places that are like high apartments and everything. We think in those instances, the middle class individuals are still going to be able to pay for those properties anyway. So these same people who are bidding for higher prices are just going to pay at that maximum price anyway. Poorer individuals still aren't going to be able to compete. On the lower density side, we think that individuals who didn't necessarily have high value in land property can just go to the maximum price anyway and exploit the poorer people. So you don't solve the issue anyway. Exploitation still continues on your side because individuals who are in the lower density areas can't actually do anything. Secondly, then, is the clash on legitimacy. The only point on the legitimacy is a practical thing, but let's utilize it. That firstly, it's an unstable economy and it shouldn't be able to regulate itself. Two reasons for why we believe it regulates itself. Firstly, one, most property developers are not going to say like my house is 2 billion rand. It's an impractical thing in which they are going to do. But secondly, then, the reason why we tell you it's legitimate to not regulate these places is because we simply believe on our side that there's a sense of economic stability that we have to ensure. We have to ensure properties aren't being devalued because when they are being devalued, there's economic crashes. Like in 2008, when we were valuing houses at the wrong prices. At the point at which there's no stability, no to put harm onto the individuals and citizens within those countries because once your economic your economy crashes, you have to cater for these individuals. But secondly, then at the point at which there's no stability, you're not catering for the best citizens. On their side, the only reason that they say that this is a legitimate thing to do is because the economy can't, or this economy can't regulate itself. And this is because of its high demand. Note, at no point does this demand ever decrease. What we tell you is that when you allow more individuals to come to these cities, you increase that demand. And just as they said, the supply does not increase on their side. When the supply does not increase, I ask you, where do those individuals go? Are they going to go back to the rural areas? Are they going to sleep on those lands, hoping that one day they may receive a property? This is to clearly show you that most of their argumentation was illogical and was flawed. They didn't actually understand why individuals were coming to those cities and why individuals were putting money into those places. So the impact of this clash is to show you that, one, under principle, they actually don't understand that the government mandate is to show development and economic sustainability. And those are two things in which they can't do on their side. But secondly to that, they actually don't have a principle. Most of it is pragmatic. To end off the speech is to clearly show you two things. Firstly, one, the side proposition that we're able to comparatively show you that we're legitimate and we're able to ensure that better investment is on our side. But secondly is to show you that we can still provide those basic necessities even if you aren't living in major cities, because we get things like taxation, we get things through other systems of money. I ask you one question. The poor individual, does he care if he lives in Sandton with no food, or does he care if he lives in a semi-poor area with lots of food and a full stomach and receiving an education? For those reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Speaker, for the reference speech. At this point, we'll now have the summary of both teams and we'll take side opposition first. Opposition reply. Ready when you are.
Cool. Can everyone hear
Just
me?
so advised to keep your cameras on. Yeah, you're audible.
Hello. All right.
Yeah,
Perfect.
hello, you're audible.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Realistically, developing nations do not have much of a choice. Either you choose having to have a lavish lifestyle in a very suitable housing, or you choose to have a meal for the next day. We think that individuals would choose the latter because that is the only choice that they have. We don't care about the kind of house that we live in, as long as we have the ability to eat in that house, as long as we have the ability to sustain our livelihoods. We think that comparative is quite clearly what makes opposition win this debate. Two clashes that we're going to be talking about. Firstly, what benefit do we have to developing nations? And secondly, is it legitimate for us to have a maximum price set towards these residential areas? Let's deal with the first clash. We think that we got two things from the proposition. Firstly, how we need to have jobs, therefore we put people in these high residential areas. But secondly, the high density areas and the spectrum that exists around that. What did we tell you in response in terms of our matter? We told you firstly that we'd have a much bigger strain on the very same residential areas because of overpopulation in them. Secondly, how you aren't likely to get investment because of that overpopulation. Most likely going to get a much bigger competition towards infrastructure and towards having jobs, which damages the amount of income that you're likely to get in the very same areas. Why do we think that we win this clash given those two arguments? Firstly, let's talk about the lower density spectrum that they talk about. We think that the lower density areas is where the middle class is already. And we think that within their policy, that's most likely where they're going to be migrating from to the high density areas. What that means then is that the very same distinction that you set for individuals is the same one that sets itself up for failure. Because of how individuals continuously want to move into much bigger areas, we think that they're most likely going to be overflowing those areas and investment isn't likely to happen. But secondly, we think that the job capacity and the ability to be able to find a job in those spaces is likely to be harmful because of how you are in a space that is heavily crowded. But secondly, you don't have the ability to afford the basic necessities that we already talked about. I'll reflect much more on this on the principal clash. But we think in total, we think that we win this clash specifically because of the practicality of their case. We don't think that they have much ability to succeed because of the overpopulation that we have within these residential areas. The second clash then, the principle of these maximum prices. What did we get from their side? We got firstly an idea of how people don't have to pay an arm and leg for a house once we have their policy. Secondly, how government cannot continue regulating itself. And thirdly, how we need to stop exploitation. What did we tell you in response to these three principles? Firstly, we told you how we do not fulfill the role of government as we don't see much being done to solving the main issue, which is like affording basic necessities. We think on our side, we have a much realistic perspective of how people need to be surviving, because in the very same developing nations, we think that bread costs more than it should be, and we think that's a problem. Secondly, you exclude the poorer individuals who cannot already pay for rental prices. Why do we think that we win this clash then? Two reasons. Firstly, we have the priority of much important obligations in hand on our side, because we provided you the alternative to say that we'd much rather set maximum prices on things like food, on things like having to afford the basic necessities that are important and essential to people's lives. But secondly, the real reason why people need to pay an arm and leg for stuff is because of how they cannot afford the necessities that we talked about. So you not being able to afford food is much more likely to to harm the kind of place that you're living in, and having to be forced into some other place is most likely going to be much more harmful, given as to how you don't solve the problem of having to afford food to begin with. We think that that not being regulated is a problem, and that doesn't really be solved on their side. Why then do we think, what heightened obligation do we have, and why do we think that that obligation is fulfilled on our side? Firstly, the biggest obligation we have is to make sure that we have the ability to afford much smaller and vital necessities. But secondly, we think that if you can regulate food pricings, you'd most likely get the very same lifestyle that proposition vouchers for. We do that much better on our side. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much, speaker, for that fine speech. We now have the very final speaker. Minutes after that, sorry. So we now have the very final summary from side proposition. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I couldn't hear well. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, audible, but just a second for me to get the right timer working. Yes, you're audible. A second. Okay, good. You are good to go.
Okay, I'm not sure about network issues, so I won't be switching on my camera. I'll be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, at the point in which side proposition holistically looks at a large city, taking into consideration the spectrum that it is, from the low density areas where houses are more affordable to rent in, to the high density areas where houses are slightly more expensive, right? We see that side proposition wins this debate. Now we see three major clashes throughout the course. We see necessities, economic growth, and exploitation. First of all, on the basis of necessities, what we get from side opposition. Opposition tells us that the necessities that are in this world are food, education, and the like, of which they choose to ignore housing as a necessity. But once again, side proposition shows to you and reiterates time and time again the importance of housing, how housing is a basic human right, and how as a government you're mandated to ensure that people have some sort of housing and aren't living on the street, right? We tell you that at the point in which you put a price, you put a maximum price and you ensure that people cannot put the prices, cannot put rent too high for others to afford or for other people to afford. Granted that you're not saying housing is free, but housing is not too expensive such that people have to pay an arm and a leg to ensure that they have a house or place to live. We show you that our house, our side of the house, best caters for all the necessities that a human being needs. Now, a key concession that is seen on side opposition is that they have no real issue with the idea of a maximum cap, right? They have no real issue with the idea of a maximum price. What they have an issue with is the fact that we're doing it on housing, right? The fact that we're doing it on rentals within these large cities, right? We tell you that because of the concession that maximum prices as a whole or as a theory are fundamentally not wrong or are principally not wrong and are justified, we tell you that side opposition automatically loses this debate at the point in which they try and debate it and they try and shift the focus to other necessities such as food and education, which we still best achieve on our side of the house at the point in which we allow other people to divert the money that previously would have been spent on rent to these other necessities such as food, right? So that's the point of necessities. Economic growth. So on economic growth, they give us this idea of not taking away a source of taxes, because they claim that these residential areas are such a high source of taxes or such a high source of income, right? They also give us the idea of investments. They tell us that these places are where investments are likely to happen. Now, throughout the courses of our speech, right, on the entire proposition bench, we tell you that we still do achieve economic growth by ensuring that people have employment opportunities. We show you in our first speech how these large cities are a beacon for economic growth and are a beacon for economic employment opportunities, right? We tell you that at the point in which more people can access this beacon and more people can live within these areas, you're more likely to have economic growth. They try to preach to us the idea of overpopulation and high densities, but we tell you that even if outside of the house were to have overpopulation, right, you still achieve a situation where people have access to more opportunities than if people were living in the rural area, right? So let's just say hypothetically side opposition did win the clash on economic growth, right? We tell you that our side of the house does achieve economic growth. And in addition to this, we allow people and we provide people with the necessities with other necessities, right? By providing them with spare money to ensure that they get access to these necessities, right? So on the basis of economic growth, we win this clash, and two, give an extra additive, which is why we feel as though proposition wins this one as well. Finally, on exploitation. First speaker does an exquisite job at framing to you how people are likely to be exploited and how prices are likely to be exorbitant, right? We get no engagement on this, right? Except for the simple fact that they claim that not everyone deserves to live in Sandton with a lavish lifestyle. We tell them to engage with the fact that there are multiple different types of housing and there are going to be multiple different types of caps, right? To which they refuse to do this. Side proposition looks at the motion holistically, which is why we feel as though we deserve to win. With this, I've never been prouder to propose.
So thank you very much, Speaker, for a very fine speech. Thank you all for your wonderful speeches. We've come to the end of the round. And at this point, I would just appreciate if teams could move back to